You're building an app, MVP, or software and are wondering whether Bubble is the right no-code platform for you. There are lots of app builders out there, so what makes this one so great or not so great? If you decide to use it, will you be kicking yourself later on? Will you have to transfer your app to another platform? Will you even be able to? The last thing you want to do is build your app the wrong way right from the start because the kind of setbacks you'd face could be really damaging. In this video, we're going to cover the biggest questions entrepreneurs and founders ask when considering Bubble. Watch this to learn whether Bubble is the right app building platform for your specific app, and if it is, where to go from there. These are the big questions we're going to be breaking down. First, you need to decide whether Bubble's right for an MVP, and not just any MVP, but your specific project because every app is unique. After that, we'll talk about the elephant in the room. Bubble is pretty new. How do you know they'll last? This is a valid concern and not one to be taken lightly. We'll hash that out entirely. The next big question is about plugins and using third-party services with your Bubble app. Can you use them? Are they reliable? And what are your options? We'll also dive into the topic of shared servers and how that might affect your app's performance, which is critical to its success. We'll cover all your options and questions in that section. Afterwards, we'll cover integrations, using outside resources, and connecting via APIs. The goal there is to help you figure out if Bubble will support the specific integrations you need, not just integrations in general. And lastly, we'll talk about native apps and putting your app into the iOS or Google Play stores. So let's get going and dive right into the first question. An MVP is a minimum viable product. It's the lightest, most slimmed down version of your app idea possible. It's basically a tool for testing and getting feedback. The most successful MVPs start out as things like landing pages or bare bones apps offering only their most core functionalities. All the extra features and additions come after the base idea has been validated. Now, a lot of founders understand the idea behind an MVP, but still can't bring themselves to launch something so simple. What happens is they end up putting way too much time and money into a project they haven't even tested yet, which is a mistake because you could end up spending tons of effort and resources building something you don't know for sure people want. The thing is, your MVP can look and operate professionally and still function around a single core idea. It can look as sleek as you want, even if it's built in a few days. It doesn't and shouldn't be an embarrassing show of work, which is what a lot of entrepreneurs fear when they hear the word MVP. So with those ideas in mind, let's go back to the question. Is Bubble good for building a startup MVP? The answer is absolutely. Not only can you build a professional looking and operating product, you can even build one for free if you want. But let's dig a little deeper. Here are two reasons you might not feel like Bubble's the right fit for you. The first is if you need to build a native app from the start. Bubble is amazing for building web applications. And while you can use Bubble to build your native app, you'll need to use outside resources to do so, like PhoneGap, GoNative, or DropSource, which I'll link to below. Usually, the benefits of Bubble make using those extra services worthwhile, but if you're not comfortable with the idea of using Bubble alongside another service to eventually launch a native app, it's something to consider. The second reason you might be hesitant to use Bubble is because you might not be sure whether it'll handle the eventual features and functionality you want your app to have. Bubble can handle most MVP needs. Of course, it's easier to start on the platform you'll stay on long term. So if Bubble doesn't offer the capability to build out all the features and functionality you're planning on post MVP, it might not be the right option. With that in mind, though, the data you gather after launching your MVP might change your app's direction. You might end up learning that the features you eventually want aren't even what your target market really needs. You won't know that kind of info until you launch and test. At the end of the day, though, Bubble could end up handling exactly what you need without you realizing it up front. Since building an MVP on Bubble takes little to no money and very low time investment, it could still be worth it to build your MVP on Bubble for testing, even if you do end up transitioning to another platform afterwards. Now, let's talk about Bubble and its long-term outlook. Bubble is still pretty new. Is it here for the long haul? This is a valid question. With any platform still in its initial stages of growth, it can feel like going all in comes with a huge risk. I mean, what if Bubble's growth stalls, or what if something happens to the company? Okay, here's the good news. Yes, Bubble is still relatively new, but the growth they've already seen is impressive. Not only did they have an explosive launch on Product Hunt, they've continued to grow since then, in both user count and staff count. They're consistently adding new team members and scaling like crazy. Of course, that doesn't mean they're out of the woods, because in truth, no business is. Fortunately, Bubble has guaranteed to release the source code of your app under an open source license if they do happen to leave the app builder scene. That means you'd be able to set up your own server and keep your app running if they no longer existed. Their basic rule is you own your data. They've referenced this in their FAQ and in the forum, which you can see here. One of the founders, Emmanuel, used an example of a Word doc to explain how you own your app. You might use Microsoft Word to create documents. Microsoft is the platform that you use to create those docs, but you're the one who owns the words and text you put on them. Okay, let's talk plugins now. Are there plugins for Bubble? Can you trust them? And will they handle the features you need? The Bubble platform is still growing every day, and their plugin collection is too. That being said, it's still not as robust as other app or website builders. If you were to look at a platform like WordPress, for example, you'd see dozens of different plugins for any and every feature you could imagine. And each of those plugins might have thousands of reviews from real users, making it easy to find what you're looking for. With Bubble, that huge collection doesn't exist quite yet, which makes sense. Think about how long WordPress has been around compared to Bubble. But that still leaves the question, can you rely on Bubble's plugin library, and will it let you build the features you need? Well, there are a few ways to look at this. No, there aren't as many plugin options as you might want, but since Bubble requires no programming, if you do need a specific feature, you can probably build it on your own, exactly how you want. From what I've seen, other app building platforms might have a plugin that sort of does what you want, but using it could come with sacrifices because the plugins are limiting and only offer a small amount of capability. Bubble removes the word compromise from this whole scenario, though, because you don't have to use a plugin that's sort of right for you if the perfect one doesn't exist. Instead, you can just build it. And of course, that's all well and good, but what if you don't want to build your own features? The good news is there is an answer for that. If there's simply no plugin available for what you need and you don't want to build it, another option is connecting to a third-party app if it has a compatible API. This means if another app or service does exactly what you need, you don't have to use a plugin. Instead, you can create an account with that third-party service, connect via API, and have all your features up and running in no time. If you aren't sure what APIs are or how to use them, I'll link to an API resource for that below. Going back to plugins, though, another valid concern is whether or not they're reliable. The way the marketplace works is anyone can create and publish a plugin, which can either be free or paid. So the question is whether those user-created plugins are reliable since anyone can build them. The good news is, if you're concerned about this, Bubble themselves have developed a number of their own plugins for you to use, which makes them both very reliable and well supported. So if a random Bubble user once created a plugin, then got busy or forgot about it down the road, you might have trouble getting help when you need it, if you needed to customize or troubleshoot, for example. With plugins built by Bubble, though, you'll have the full support of their team. So yes, there are some trade-offs. Bubble might not have every single plugin you need, and some plugins might be built, then left behind at some point. But even so, with the ease Bubble offers to no-code developers, it's hard to pass up a platform like this when there are other options when it comes to plugins. Weigh the pros and cons for yourself. If there's absolutely no plugin available for you, can you connect via API instead? If not, can you build a feature on your own or work with a developer? That's what you'll need to decide. Here's the next big one, and this is a hot topic among anyone deciding whether or not to use Bubble. Will you be sharing a server, and how will that affect performance? Okay, unless you're on a dedicated plan, which is like an enterprise option, your app will be hosted on a shared server. This means one server powers multiple apps. For example, if one of those apps decides to run thousands and thousands of workflows per minute, your app's own performance could potentially lag and features could malfunction. The question is it worth taking that risk? While it can seem scary to share a server with unknown apps who could decide to suck all the server juice up at once, realistically, that's unlikely to happen. But you do have options. The first is to upgrade your bubble plan to a dedicated one, where you get your own personal server, and this option is more expensive, so it might not be the right fit for you, at least in the beginning, but it is available. The second is to buy individual capacity units. Bubble allows you to add extra units of capacity to your application. So if you do need an extra boost, you don't necessarily have to upgrade to a higher plan. You can simply buy the amount of extra capacity that your app needs. Again, though, most apps, especially in their initial stages, operate just fine on a shared server and with the default amount of server capacity units that they are given. And most web and app building platforms function in the exact same way anyway, where lower plans share servers. That's just how it works, and typically you won't have a problem. Aside from a shared server affecting app functionality, you might also be wondering whether security could also be affected. Fortunately, sharing a server doesn't mean sharing an app. Those are two very different things, and no one will ever be able to see or access your app just because you're sharing a server. App privacy is a separate topic. If you're interested in learning more, I do cover it in depth in my Fast Track course, which I'll link to below. The next question is whether you'll be able to use specific integrations with your app. And if the core usage of your app relies solely on integrating with an outside service or app, this question will definitely be front of mind because if you can't integrate with Bubble, you could be out of options. Let's break this answer down into a few main parts. First, do you have a banking-related app? Bubble is not PCI compliant, meaning you cannot store sensitive data within your app. So if your app is related to banking in some way, like a student loan tracker, budget tracking, personal finance, investments, etc., then you'd need to come in with a solid plan of action for how that sensitive data will be safely processed and stored. Now, to be clear, you can still use Bubble, but you'd have to use another PCI compliant app to store all of that information, or use the third-party service you're integrating with to store the data. These are usually in payment gateways like Stripe, PayPal, or Plaid. Unfortunately, if using an outside service is not an option for you, or if there are no other third-party options, you'd need to find an app builder that is PCI compliant. Second, is your app health-related? The same concern lies with health-related apps. Think apps that help book doctor's appointments or ones for internal clinic use, like for check-in, to store patient info, etc. Just like Bubble isn't PCI compliant, it's also not HIPAA compliant, meaning you can't store patient information within your app. Now, HIPAA is a US law, but if you are elsewhere in the world, I think it's still important for you to understand where Bubble lies at this level of compliancy. In this situation, you'd have to integrate with a compliant third party who could store the sensitive information for you. Again, though, there are third-party services out there for this. It's just a matter of finding one that works for you and will connect with Bubble. Okay, the next question is, does your app just need a really specific integration? PCI and HIPAA compliancy aside. If you know you have to integrate with a very specific third party, and I'm talking one single option where you have no wiggle room allowed on what service you can connect with, deciding whether you can use Bubble is as simple as checking whether your third-party service offers a compatible RESTful API connection. Any third-party service or app will have the documentation for their APIs. And if they're compatible with Bubble, you'll be in the clear. Typically, you'll need to check in the footer of the service's website for a link that says something like developers. That's usually where that link is found. If you can't find it, you can always reach out and ask them. Okay, this question comes up a lot. Can you put a Bubble app in the iTunes App Store or Google Play Stores? Here's the thing. Bubble is not a native app builder, and it is not designed for building apps specifically for those app stores. Just as an aside, native apps are ones built for the app marketplaces, like the ones that you can download from the iOS or Google Play Store and add to your phone's home screen. That's a really simplified explanation, but just keep that in mind here. Okay, but here's the next thing. Because of how much easier Bubble is than other app builders, some people still use the platform to create their app and then use another service to make it native. The good thing is, you do have options. The main thing to know is you'd have to use both Bubble and a service like Go Native or Drop Source in combination. I mentioned this a little earlier, and I'm linking to a few of these in the description below, so make sure to take a look there. In a nutshell, though, in Bubble, you'd build the back end of your app. In Drop Source, or an equivalent, you'd build the front end. Or if you're using what's called a wrapping service, you'd build your whole app in Bubble and then wrap it to make it compatible for the app stores. Those are linked below too, so you can learn more about that. But of course, doing that means potentially paying for two services, learning to use two platforms, or finding developers for two platforms. So for some people, Bubble makes building an app so easy that using a third-party service to make it native is totally worth it. In that case, not only can you drag and drop while building your app, you also don't need to know any Android or iOS code. The question is whether that trade-off is worth it for you. Do you want to use a third-party service in addition to Bubble? You'll have to decide that on your own. So after going through all of that, if you've decided Bubble's the right app platform for you, there are a bunch of other questions probably flooding in. How in the world do you get started? Bubble is no code, but like with any new platform, there's still a learning curve. I want to quickly go over some of the ways I got started with Bubble and some suggestions on how you can do the same and get going with your app. First, jump in and play around with your editor's tools. There's no better way to get a feel for the Bubble platform than to spend some time navigating on your own. You can set up a free account for this, so don't worry about spending any money yet or putting in your credit card info. Once you get set up on the platform, try putting together a rough wireframed version of your idea. Use different elements like text, image, video, and groups. You'll start to get a feel for the tools and will better understand what to look for when they're referenced in the tutorials you use. Just play around and don't give yourself a deadline. If you're still not sure where to go from there, start with some free tutorials. If you're still testing the waters to decide whether Bubble is right for your app, software, or MVP, there are free tutorials you can find online and on YouTube. I actually have my own email subscription where I send out new tutorials to subscribers every single week. And if you haven't browsed through my YouTube channel, I suggest doing that too, just to get a feel for what you can do with Bubble. I'll link to my site down below so you can subscribe to my email list. There's also a free PDF I'll send you that teaches the best ways to build an app on Bubble. Ultimately, the idea is to just get started building your app and testing out different options. From there, everything will start to snowball and grow. If this is sounding like it's going to be a long road to getting your app launched, don't worry. If you're in a rush to launch and already know Bubble's right for you, there are other higher level resources you can use. If you're looking to move straight into development instead of spending time learning, so you can test your app with real users, run a beta launch, apply for funding, etc., you can partner with Bubble's developers who will either help build your app or build the entire thing for you. I also offer both consulting and development services, but if mine aren't the right fit for you, this is still an option you should consider with other developers. One other thing I want to note here, and this is the last time I'll mention one of my own products, is that you can also take courses to help speed up your learning process exponentially. So if hiring a developer or consultant is a bit too much, but learning from free resources is a bit too slow, take a look at my Fast Track course, which teaches how to build a Bubble app from the ground up. It's the best resource out there that's been helping other people in your shoes cut months off their development time and save a lot of money in the process. I'll link to that below too. And again, there are other courses out there to help you with Bubble. Fast Track is just the most comprehensive one that's designed for people building apps they want to either turn into a business or use to support their existing business. So it's not a course for cloning a social media app or something like that, for example. Lastly, don't forget the Bubble Forum. When I first started learning Bubble, the forum was invaluable. While it doesn't always give you direct or timely answers, it does have a wealth of knowledge and people you can interact with. The forum can take some sifting, but I encourage you to spend some time there, even if only to build your familiarity with Bubble lingo and resources. Okay, so how do you move forward from here? Because deciding which platform to build your app on isn't an easy process. Not only do you need to know that the platform will be able to handle all your app's needs, like features and functionality, but you also need to know it'll be a solid solution for the long run. If you're like most founders or entrepreneurs wanting to build an app without coding, my guess is you're leaning heavily towards using Bubble. And in most cases, I think it's one of the best options for building your app. Even so, you need to ask the important questions before committing. Is Bubble good for a startup or MVP? Remember, if you're building an MVP on Bubble, you first need to define your MVP. What core features do you need to release right from the start? And if your MVP needs to be a native app right off the bat, you'll have some extra steps to consider. But for the most basic minimum viable products, Bubble is a reliable solution. The next consideration is, if Bubble is still relatively new, how can you rely on it? This is a question I asked myself in the beginning too. How do you know Bubble will continue to grow and expand? What if the company gets bought out? What if a big name competitor comes in and shifts the entire market? The best answer is you're taking that same risk with any platform, especially when it comes to no or low code tools, which are all relatively new. There are a few other platforms offering what Bubble does, and any that do run similar long-term risks. But consider Bubble's promise to release the underlying code of your application if they ever do tap out. Not all platforms commit to something like that, which makes Bubble's promise a significant reassurance. The next question is, are there enough plugins for what you need? Bubble's plugin database is still small in comparison to other established app or site builders out there. That being said, Bubble makes connecting with APIs immensely more available, which brings down the need for plugins at the start. The next question is whether you'll have to share a server if you use Bubble. To be honest, this one is simple. Even though it's a big fear for a lot of people, the fact is, just like any hosting platform out there, lower plans share a server. So your free or low use plans will rarely, if ever, come with a dedicated server, no matter what platform you're using. You can, however, pay for a dedicated server on a higher plan. It just depends on what you need. That leads us to the next question. Will the specific integration you need work with Bubble? Now, this depends. If you look over the API documentation for the integration you need, you'll be able to find out whether it'll connect seamlessly with Bubble. Also, consider taking a look at Zapier integrations, which you can use in combination with Bubble. And lastly, can you put your Bubble app in the App Store? The answer, you absolutely can. Many of my own students do so themselves. That being said, there are more steps involved than you might like since Bubble apps aren't native. In order to get into an app store, you need to use a third-party or wrapping service to get your app ready. So yes, it's definitely possible. You'll just need to do a little more legwork. Fortunately, Bubble makes everything else so easy, it's usually worth it. After considering those main questions, start playing around on the Bubble platform if you haven't already. You can sign up for a free plan if you're still not sure whether you want to commit. By navigating the editor and experimenting with different elements, you'll be able to get a good sense of the ease of use. From there, my guess is you'll be hooked. If you have questions or want to check out the resources I mentioned in this review, head down to the video description below so that you can keep moving forward with your app.